Why is Africa so poor? How could a place that holds trillions of dollars in rare minerals, gems, and other resources be so incredibly impoverished? And for many, the answer is simple enough. Africa is poor because of the legacy of colonialism. The narrative usually goes something like this. Europe's great powers invaded, conquered, and pillaged Africa of its raw resources, leaving the continent impoverished to this very day. Now, more than 60 years after the end of colonial rule, the continent is still struggling to overcome decades of exploitation at the hands of the European powers. It's a compelling narrative, and many people believe it. But the problem is, it doesn't seem to be telling the whole story, and here's the proof. Consider the story of another ex-colony that gained its independence around the same time as most African nations. Singapore, a former British colony with virtually no natural resources, has risen to become one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Today, Singapore is actually richer on a per capita basis than its former colonizer. So if colonialism doesn't tell the entire story there, is there anything else that can explain why Africa specifically is so poor? Well, one interesting factor is Africa's geography. The economist Thomas Sowell points out that bad geography has hindered the continent's development for centuries and continues to do so to this very day. For example, while Europe's long coastline and plentiful natural harbors helped to facilitate a strong maritime trade all the way back to classical antiquity, Africa has had few of these features. In fact, the continent actually has less coastline than Europe, despite the fact that it's much bigger. It has very few deep-water ports, and with the exception of the Nile, none of Africa's major rivers are easily navigable all the way to the ocean. These geographical problems create huge challenges to trade in Africa, but geography is not destiny. Just look at Botswana. This sub-Saharan country has set records for economic growth despite being landlocked in the middle of the Kalahari Desert. While Botswana does have plenty of diamonds, it lacks many of the other major natural resources, rivers, or harbors that many of its neighbors do. And yet, Botswana is one of the richest nations in Africa with a strong and growing economy. The story of both Botswana and Singapore show that the true culprits behind Africa's persistent poverty has to be something else. Now consider this. In the Tanzanian Constitution in 1965, it discussed the government's role to, quote, prevent the accumulation of wealth to an extent which is inconsistent with the existence of a classless society. This Marxist sentiment was not unusual in sub-Saharan African governments post-colonialism. The bottom line is, many former colonies have not only overcome prior subjugation, but have thrived both politically and economically. But they all seem to have something in common. Instead of trading colonialism for Marx, they adopted systems which encouraged private property rights while at the same time embracing stable governments which established dependable legal systems and then courted foreign investment. The good news is there is hope for countries still struggling to develop. But history suggests that it will come not only through political freedom, but economic freedom as well.